try not to put too much hot air into the room. So I'm going to talk about profiling with FHIR. And so I had intended that this session was going to be a bit of a combination of presentation and demonstration, but one thing I always do is do far too many slides, and so I've got about 50 odd slides to get through. So what I'm going to do, I've got lots of screenshots, so I'll go through the presentation. You have to take any questions that you have as they come up. If we have time at the end, then I'll go back into the actual tooling itself and do a demonstration. If we run out of time, then, and if you're still interested, then maybe this afternoon we can find a room and we'll go through it in general. So what I really want to do is I want to talk about what a process for doing profiling would be. Now, hands up, who's familiar with profiling, FHIR profiling? At least what it actually is. Okay, that's great. So it's really all about making FHIR meet your particular use cases. It's becoming really, really important, and I think it's an area where we're going to be able to get clinicians more involved in the whole process. I think FHIR as a spec has kind of been accepted by the techies. We're kind of moving out of that, moving into the clinical space, and profiling is I think the channel by which we can achieve that. And really where FHIR sits is as tooling to assist you in doing that. So I'm going to talk about that process. This is, and I should say, this is my own feelings for process. This is not official FHIR process. There might be better ways of doing it, but these are the sort of things I think you want to go through. I think you'll start out by defining your business requirements for whatever it is that you are doing. You'll create your logical models. And these are new in FHIR, and I think there'll be some more talks on clinical models, logical models coming up. Then you want to create your value sets. Then you want to do a bit of a gap analysis between the information that you've collected and what you need to do for FHIR. Then you'll create your extension definitions. You'll build a profile, and then you can actually build resource instances from that profiling. So that's the overall process that I'm going to describe. I'll kind of go through it twice. The next time, right now I'm going to go through each one in a little bit more detail, and then once I've done that, I'm then going to go through how you would do it using the FHIR tool. So the first step, establishing your business requirements. So this is probably stuff which would be familiar with most of you, I am sure. Locating your subject matter expert, documenting your use cases. Really, really important to document what it is that you are trying to achieve. And you're focusing, of course, on the interoperability use cases. What actual data is being shared? You know, what's the information that you want to be able to exchange between parties? What paradigm? This is kind of important as well. Are you in a RESTful paradigm? Is it document? Is it messages? You might not be able to establish this up front, but it's the sort of thing you need to have in the back of your mind. And then things like privacy, edge cases, test data, and so forth. Test data. Never forget test data when you're doing this kind of stuff, particularly if you're dealing with clinical and other folk. The next step, having done that, will be to define your logical models. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about logical models in just a second, but the logical model is really, it's like an information model. It's a way of representing the data that you're trying to share in a structured form. And within any particular sort of problem that you're trying to solve, there may be one, so you might just be trying to model a single condition, or there might be more than one. So you might be trying to represent a problem list, which would be a list and the problems within that list. When you're doing this kind of process, and again this is my opinion, when you're doing this kind of process, I think you should be aware of what FHIR is and what the resources are, but you shouldn't be constrained by them. Because this process is really when you're dealing with business experts, with clinicians, with BAs and so forth, and they're not really interested in FHIR. Kind of hard to believe, I know, but there we go. That's it. So I think in this sort of process, you're a bit open. You're really trying to capture what people are wanting to share. And as I say, so the idea is really to be able to collect information from clinical folk in some kind of semi-structured way. This process is very similar, of course, to the open air stuff, to the CKM that Graham was talking about in the previous session, if you were there. Once you've got your information models, the next sort of step is to define and create the value sets for the structured data. Again, this is something we'll come to in just a bit of a second, and we'll talk more about value sets, but I think this is the next step in your process. So you've got your information model, your logical model. You need to be identifying what are the value sets that describe the terms for the structured data that you want to capture. You can actually bind these things into your logical model if you want to, and that's sort of helpful to do that. And you'll certainly need them when you create your profiles. Sometimes you can find a value set. More often than not, you need to be able to create a value set. Right here, right now, we don't have fantastically good tooling inside of FHIR to create value sets. FHIR's got a very basic one, which at some point hopefully I'll be able to show you. I know that there are much more sophisticated ones that are being developed out there in the community. But in terms of process, this is the point at which I think you need to be identifying your value sets, because you've still got your clinicians in front of you, you're still sort of talking to your clinical folk, so it's a good time to be able to say, well, what's the kind of data that you need to capture for this particular element? Once you've done that, that's the time that you're now into your gap analysis. So you've now sort of captured the data from your clinicians, you've identified things like your value sets. Now's the time where someone needs to sit down and kind of do a gap analysis between the data that you've collected and the artifacts and the resources inside of FHIR that you're going to need to be able to represent that data. I think the steps leading up to now in terms of the skill set that's required there is really more of an information domain skill set, someone who understands modelling a little bit, someone who's a little bit familiar with FHIR. As we move on down this chain, you really need to understand more about FHIR itself. So this sort of step really needs to be done by somebody who has a pretty good understanding of the FHIR artifacts, the structure definitions, the extension definitions, the value sets and so on and so forth. And for each resource that you identify out of your model, remember a particular logical model may have more than one resource type that you identify, you need to identify which of the elements that are in a resource and you don't need. So the example I've given in other ones is if you've identified, say, a condition and you don't need to test it, then you can take it out. So part of your gap analysis is saying, what's in FHIR that isn't in my model? And then what are the differences? What are the changes? You know, are there, within the model that I've identified, say patient for the sake of argument, patient's got an identifier, in the standard FHIR patient resource, you can have multiple identifiers. Does your information model need multiple identifiers? So you look at the multiplicity there. Then what are the new elements that you need to add? So what are the data items that are in your model which aren't in the FHIR resources? And these are going to become, of course, extensions. Now you can do lots of other things as well. We're starting to get quite complicated in there, so I'm not going to go there. But just to be aware that there's a lot more detail that you can go into at that sort of point. And I want to reiterate this point about extensions, which I hope has come up again and again throughout this Dev Days. Extensions are normal. So it is expected that pretty much every production implementation of FHIR is going to have extensions in some way, manner or form. And that's really an outcome of the way that FHIR was actually designed. It was designed, you know, the rule of 80% that you might have heard of. An extension always has to have a computable definition. There is no ifs or buts about that. You must do that. And you should reuse extension definitions if you possibly can. And again, we'll touch on that a little bit more in the next bit. Once you've done your gap analysis, you can then go out and you can actually locate your extension definitions. And so it's defining the elements, I've talked about that. It's quite important to appreciate that these extensions have got exactly the same capabilities as a standard FHIR resource type, including things like references between other resources. You can do anything with an extension that you can do out of the standard FHIR models. Again, prefer to reuse if possible. And just a point here that the actual FHIR specification itself actually includes a number of extensions as part of that core specification. And so what we're actually imagining, we haven't quite got there in the community as yet, but we're imagining that there will be a hierarchy of extension definitions. Those that are in the core spec, those that are defined by a jurisdiction like a country, those that are defined by a project and so forth. And we're imagining that there will be registries set up, and Simplifier, is the tooling out of Furore that we're imagining that will do that. So in reality, when you're at this kind of step, you know what your extension is because you've figured it out from the steps previously. You've got to go out and see if one already exists. You look in the core spec. If it's not there, you'll look in Simplify. If it's not there, then that's when you create one for yourself. So it's kind of a process to go through. You don't have to do that, but it will make interoperability a lot easier if we can reuse extension definitions. You're now in a position where you can actually build your profiles. And recall that a profile is something which adapts a resource to a specific need. Technically, it's a structure definition resource. And again, another point, This is exactly the same resource as the core specification uses. You can actually go to any of the standard online specs, like Graham's server or the Happy server or anything like that, and you can pull up the structure definition representation of the core resource types. There's one for patient, there's one for condition, and so on and so forth. So the profiling is built on that same infrastructure. In New Zealand, we have the term "eat your own dog food," which is pretty disgusting, really, but you sort of get the impression. I've come across a nicer one, but I can't quite think of it off the top of the head. And really, this kind of profiling stuff is actually the main output of this exercise. So what you want to achieve from the beginning, from the requirements through to this point here, are what these profiles look like. And this is really why I've suggested this particular sequence, because in order to do your profiles, you need to have found or located your extension definitions and your value sets. So that's the reason why I've suggested that particular process. And then once you've done that, you're now in a position, if you wish to go and build resource instances and to view instances. And this is where the ClinFire tooling that we talked about yesterday. Who was in the talk yesterday, by the way? Oh, good, okay, so you're familiar with that. That's actually where ClinFire came out of, as I think I might have mentioned there. It has the ability to visualize what real resources look like. So again, what this can do is this takes you from sort of end to end, if you like, from business all the way through to visualization of an actual resource. So I'm now going to talk about the ClinFire tooling itself. And I talked about this yesterday. Before I do that, I just want to point out and make it quite clear where ClinFire sits in the scheme of things. So ClinFire is not an official part of the Fire core specification. It's something that we started building a couple of years ago when clinicians started to get involved in the sort of development process of Fire. We realised that they needed something to help visualise it, and it's kind of grown up and out of that. It's an open source tool that I maintain. It is not intended to compete in any way with the official tooling such as Forge and Simplify and such like. So I kind of want to make that clear. The purpose is more educative. It's more to help people understand how things work. It's as we've kind of added capabilities to it, so that you can actually go through, create something end to end, see if it all works, and then potentially you might want to replicate these things using something like Forge or Simplify and so forth. So again, just want to be quite clear of that. And we work very closely with the core team. When you're using ClinFire, and I spoke about this yesterday, it has the concept of server roles, server types. So you have a server where the patient and data is stored. You have a server where your conformance resources, and that's your extension definitions and profiles are stored. And then a terminology server. That's the one where your value sets are stored, and which also supplies the various terminology services which ClinFire needs to operate. You can have different servers. You can have on the same server. My suggestion, if you're going to go out and have a play, is to use the Happy STU3 server for the data and the profiles, and use Graham's server for the terminology. The reason for that is that Graham's server tends to be the most up-to-date with the spec, and that's, on a way, a really good thing because you're up-to-date with the spec, and on the other hand, a really bad thing because things change, ClinFire breaks. Happy is a little bit more forgiving than that. So this is the combination I found that works best. This is what the front page looks like. You can access it from clinfire.com. I'll show you a link in a sec. And you can see that I've selected over there the 3 servers. I've also dropped down this menu option here. And the reason why I've done that is just to show you that that's where the various parts of the tool that I'm going to talk about, the logical model, the value set editor, extension definitions and profiles in particular, that's where you select them, is off this front page. And now the vision has gone, so I am going to hold my breath. Wasn't my fault. It's always important when something goes wrong that you can establish blame to somebody else. So you're in the front row, so you're a natural target here. I do apologise. So that's where you go to actually come to some of these things, to actually call up the functions, which I'm just going to show you. Now my screen is not showing that. Is that working? Okay, that's weird. So my screen and that are now disconnected, so we'll see. I call this up because if you look at that top icon at the top right, that's where you can log in. I only ask you to log in so that it makes it possible when tracing down problems to find out which is the stuff you're working on. This information is not for sale, resale, or anything else like that. There is no PHI. That's something else I should put. If you're using ClinFire, do not please put any personal health information on there. These are public servers. Anybody can access them. Please, please, please don't put real data on there. It's test data. So that's really just for the purpose of being able to sort of keep things apart. Some of the functions you can only access, you can only edit if you log in. Logging is really easy. Enter in an email and a password. If you don't already exist, it will create it for you. End of story. Real simple thing, no big deal, but it's something that you do need to do. Okay, so I've talked about the overall process. I've talked about just how to get into ClinFire. I'm going to go through each of those steps in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to show you how you would do it using the ClinFire tooling. As I say, for now, what I'll do is I'll show you screenshots on the thing. If we have time, I'll come back to it and show you the real tool, or this afternoon we can sit down and we can go through them in more detail. So just to emphasise the purpose of the logical model, to capture the data from the clinicians in structured form. What the logical models do is they build models, they use the same infrastructure as standard FHIR does. It uses structured definitions, for example, to actually represent the model. And that means that the rest of the tooling, the rest of the stack works quite smoothly. We had a lovely episode last night where some Diego Kaminka from Argentina had created the logical model in Forge, and he put it into Simplifier, and then he loaded up ClinFire and pointed it at it, and he was able to read it. I mean, that's just magic, isn't it? It's just wonderful the way that sort of all worked together, and I think that kind of shows the value of working on a standards-based infrastructure, because you can bring different tooling, different things to apply to the same problem. You're not locked into anything. But I wake up in the middle of the night and thought how wonderful that actually was. So anyway, we were talking about requirements. Each model could become a profile on a single resource type or on a collection, kind of working through some of the issues. Haven't got this sorted out fully just yet. But if, for example, you wanted to model a discharge summary, then you're probably going to be capturing a whole lot of sections and different items that relate to a particular kind of discharge summary. It's probably going to wind up in a document. So in turn, you're probably going to wind up with multiple profiles out of that, working through the details there. Ideally, you determine that when you're creating your model, and as I say, quite limited. At the moment, it just needs STU3 servers if you're using ClinFire. This is the kind of procedure for your logical model: get your initial requirements, build your initial models, review it with your stakeholders. And then I can see an iterative process. As you're building your logical model, you'll sit down with your stakeholders, you'll go through and you'll say, well, is this right? And they'll say, well, sort of, I need this and that and the other. That's where the value of having your value sets comes in, because people sort of understand the things a bit better if they can see it in real terms. So you might want to create a simple value set, put some sample data in there. At this stage, you can actually go in and build an instance of your logical model. And again, it just helps people to visualize what it's doing. I can see that as being an iterative process. And at the end of that, you then wind up with the knowledge of what resources what profiles you're going to need to create. This is just a screenshot of the finished model. As I say, I don't think I have time today to go through the details of this. It's all available online. We will talk to it. But what you can see is over on the left-hand side there, we have a list of models that have been created. A simple tree-like structure there of the various items that I have put in. I've selected moon phase, so this is slightly silly. This is the modelling a condition, and you want to know what the phase of the moon was when it was at its best. I thought of this after watching Harry Potter, if that wasn't obvious. And you can see down here that we have, I've actually bound a value set to the moon phase, and I actually, I actually created a value set, code of concept, and if we were to click on that, we could actually go and see what the contents of that value set actually were. So that's what you kind of come out with at the end. And of course, once you've got this sort of thing in a structured format, you can then visualize it in different ways. And again, part of what we're trying to do with ClinFire is to come up with different visualizations that help explain what things mean. This is a mind map. It's automatically generated from the model, so if you change the model, the mind map gets regenerated. It looks pretty ugly. Only a mother would love it, or a father in this particular case. If there's anybody with UI experience who's keen on helping me out, talk to me afterwards. because I do appreciate it. But there's method in the madness. The yellow ones mean our resource reference, the C means it's codable concept, and in the tooling itself you can actually click on these and see more detail. So that's what you get when you create your information model. And here is, as I say, I had planned on doing a demo, and I'll come back to it if we have an opportunity. Right, that's your information model, your logical model. Value sets. We've talked about value sets before. A couple of things I would like to go through. So, again, a few basics. Inside of FHIR, quite a few of the data, quite a few of the elements are coded. There are the three main data types that have got no code behind them. There's actually a half or one quantity is a slightly weird one because it also is bound to a value set. But these are the ones you'll come across. And of the ones, codable concept is far and away the most common one that you will use. If you're creating a logical model and you want to bind it to a value set, use codable concept unless you're really sure that you want to use one of the others. Almost always it'll be a codable concept. Just a reminder here that about the bindings, the terminology bindings in the actual specification, and this concept of binding strength. Again, something you want to think about right now. There are the various options here: required, extensible, preferred, example, and they're basically meaning that if something is required, then it must come from that set and no other. Now, what you can do in your profile is you can modify these binding strengths. You can make them stronger, you can't make them weaker. So what you can't do in a profile is take a binding that's required in the specification and make it extensible. But you can make something which is extensible required. Again, think fairly carefully about this. You know, when you make something required, you really want to have a pretty good reason for it, because the real world is such that stuff is different all over the place. In general terms, extensible is probably about as strong as you want to go. But things differ. So the value set is used to describe the possible set of values for your context, improves recording consistency. These are just some examples. Of course, as everybody knows, New Zealand is where everything is at, particularly earthquakes and such like. I shouldn't joke actually, because they're pretty tragic, but anyway. Actually, half our country's falling to pieces. I don't know if you've noticed, but Wellington, which is sort of miles and miles away, is also having buildings falling. I live in Auckland, which is a long, long way from where the earthquake is. You wanted to know that, I'm sure. So those are some examples of value sets, but there are tons of others. Tons of okay, so I thought you were looking at me serious now. This was just, again, it came from the talk yesterday, but it's quite a nice one. It was one of Graham's ones initially, but it talks about the relationship of the various components, your code system there, such as SNOMED, the value set, which is describing your subset, your element definition, which comes from your profile, which is binding to the value set, and then down the bottom there, your actual resource instance, and the value inside the instance still talks to the terminology itself. It's still a SNOMED code, for example, and then it claims to be conformant to a particular profile. And a reminder that we talk about the term claim conformance, because that's really all it is. It's a resource saying, hey, I'm conformant. If you want to be sure, you've got to go and check it. Can get really complicated. The Clinifier value set editor is pretty basic. Its purpose is really just to allow you to create a simple value set so that you can really get on with your modelling exercises, as I've said before, so that you can make something real to an end user. And this is what I was going to do for a demo, but as I say, I'll come back to it if we have a chance, otherwise we can get this out and we can do it. Right, done information model, done our value sets, extension definitions is what we're up with next. Again, this fact that only the most common elements are in the base resources. The extensions are how we add new elements. The elements that we defined. This reference to the definition is important. Normal modifier, I think we talked about that today. A modifier extension is one that the user must understand. Be real careful before you use modifier extensions. You've got to have a good reason for it. They're a pain. They just kind of get in the way of interoperability, because they effectively mean if you don't understand what my modifier extension is, you can't understand me. So be cautious. There are some reasons why you'd use them. Most of the time, try to avoid them. We expect all implementations to contain layers. The fact that extensions can be at a number of different points in your resource. So over here, You've got it against the actual resource itself, but each element itself, and indeed the data types within the elements, can have extensions. For example, in the address, you might have specific, I know Holland has specific elements they need to add to addresses. So you can add extensions at all parts of FHIR. This is an example of how in an instance, your instance is pointing to its definition. Can't overemphasize how important that is. This is what separates us from the V2Z segments. V2Z segments were a great idea, but in practice, of course, became totally unmanageable. So what FHIR does is combines the goodness of being able to create your own definitions, but to make sure that your recipient can understand them. This also points to the fact that you can represent FHIR in XML and JSON, which is good. This is where, again in ClinFHIR, if you click on that little menu item at the top, you'll come to a screen like this. You can search for extension definitions that are known on the server. There's the server at the top there. I've selected the public happy server. In this case, I've asked for all the servers where the publisher was Orion. I've got a list. I can select the extension definition. This gives me a brief breakdown of what the extension definition looks like. If I want to look at the actual JSON over there, with tags across there, but get in there and have a play, you'll see it's pretty obvious. The idea here is to try and put a friendly face on the extension definition, but let you go right into the guts of the detail if that's what you want to do. The top there is a button to create a new extension. If you click on that guy, extension definition, this looked really good when I created it. I'm not quite sure if it's so good now, but it shows the 3 different screens that you can get. Over the left-hand side is where you enter your details about your extension definition, its name, which resource it can be applied to, and so forth. And you click on that add element there, then you can say what are your data types inside your extension definition. Extension definition can be simple, i.e. you can have just one data type, or it can be complex, have multiple data types. And so if we click on multiple add elements there, we're creating a complex one, otherwise a simple one. This is where the binding can occur also. So in this example, I've clicked on the add element button there, which brought me up this element, this modal at the top. I select the codable concept, which meant that I could have a binder value set. And then I came to here and I was able to select the value set. Again, this is easier to show. So if you're interested, go and have a look at the tool, or we can go through it this afternoon. But the principle is, at the end of all of this, we wind up with an extension definition. That extension definition, if it's coded, can be bound to a value set, and we're ready for use inside of our profile. And that's where the demo will ordinarily go. Profile. So we're coming to the point that we can actually start to bring all the bits together. So a way of thinking about a profile is as if it was a template for a resource instance. The word template is horribly overloaded, but it's quite useful in this case. So it's like a cookie cutter. You know, it's what a resource would look like. ClinFHIR's got a simple profile builder, and again, this is, as I said earlier on, this is in terms of where the tooling fit together. So the purpose of ClinFHIR is so that you can get in there and do stuff and see how it works and show other people. And it only supports that subset of the FHIR capabilities that are useful. Forge, on the other hand, is far more complete. It does pretty much everything. I like to think that our user interface is rather nicer, but that's appearance perspective. So that's where they sit. Use Forge if you really want more complex stuff. In general terms, you can create a profile in Forge and you can view it in ClinFHIR, unless it's doing some of the more complex stuff. But we'll work on that as time goes on. I put this in again just to talk about the relationship between the various bits. The profile instance down the bottom, claiming conformance to a profile over there on the left-hand side. The profile itself, including extension definitions. Those extension definitions can be bound to a value set, as can elements within the profile themselves. The value set includes stuff from the terminology. In the resource instance, refers to extensions, which we've looked at just before, and also references the terminology. So I find this quite useful to visualize the bits and how they hang together. Value set, extension definition, and so forth. This is what the profile screen looks like. It's very similar to the extension definitions. I got there by clicking on that little gear menu. Same sort of thing, I can search for different profiles over there. In this case, I've searched for the profiles where the publisher is Orion. I get a listed there. Same kind of principle, details here. I can look at the JSON if I want to. If I click on the new button up the top there, this is where I'd say what the new profile is. I enter a name for the profile. The name for the profile is going to be the ID on the server. So what you actually do is you enter in a name, you click the check button. The check button makes sure that no one else has used that name. You indicate what the resource type. So a profile is against a specific resource type or more than one resource type. So you need to indicate when you're creating your profile what is the resource type that you are profiling. You can do that there. Sorry, it's one profile, my apologies. The publisher goes there, description and so forth. Then when you click OK on that, you get to a screen that looks like this. This gives you a simple hierarchical view of the profile. It starts out by, basically what you do is you say I'm profiling condition. So it goes out, pulls in the extension definition for condition and creates a little hierarchical tree like that, and that's what you start from. And you then click that little edit this profile link at the top there, and then you can start to go in and modify your profile. Effectively, you select an item in the tree, and you can then remove it from the profile. You can add an extension to the profile. You can change things like multiplicity and comments and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, the Forge interface and ClimFire interface are very similar in this respect. We both show the interface as being a hierarchical tree. There are a couple of other visualizations here which are useful that I haven't actually got screenshots of. They're in tabs across the side there. The mind map is the same kind of mind map that we saw before, just kind of lays out a cute looking mind map. The difference from base is quite useful. What that does is that looks at the profile that you've created and compares it to what the base is and highlights what the differences are, what you've taken out, what you've added in, and so forth. And the others are in there. So that's that screen there. Demo, get the opportunity. Oh, good. We're actually kind of approaching the end. So there is who's doing the clinical track or has intended to do the clinical track? Only two. Oh, what a pity. I'll talk to you afterwards. If you do get excited and you want to go and actually do some stuff, I've got some suggested exercises for you. So the first exercise is to create a resource instance. We talked about creating resource instance earlier on. So this is, you'll go in and create a new patient without creating any samples, set a condition profile, and add a condition to the patient. And then bonus points for viewing it in the resource editor and then editing it to create a different version. And also if you want to create a list resource and add the conditions to it. The second thing you might want to try is creating a simple profile. So create a profile based on condition, remove some unneeded elements, make sure you use a name that you remember, and then create an instance on that profile. The third little exercise is to actually create an extension definition. So create an extension definition, as we've talked about, create a new profile, add that extension definition to the profile, then create a resource. That should be a resource instance definition. Then create a resource instance based on that profile, and then various bonuses for creating a value set and binding to that value set. Phew. So, are there any questions at this point? If there's not, then we can. I've got a couple of things we can go back and actually go in and start doing some of these things in the tooling. Should we do that? Let's go and do that. All right. So, this room's really, really hot, isn't it? Okay, so here, now, how's this? Let's see if this is going to work for me. So this is ClimFire here. And I'll just make that a bit bigger. Move that to there. So can you see that? How's that? Okay. So here you can see I've selected the public happy server over here for my data set and my conformance server. What it does as you select items, it remembers them in the list here, so you can easily select them later on. So if I, for example, wanted to actually create a resource instance, it would be a conditional resource instance on Madison and Clark there. I select those two, I select the new resource instance, and I come into this builder screen. We looked at this yesterday, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. That's just to show you where that can go. I talked about, incidentally, editing. So what you can do is if you go to this details option through here and look at, say, a condition, so here are the conditions I've created. There's asthma there. I can look at the various renditions of that. I can see there's a tree format, there's XML. But I can also edit this resource. And if I edit this resource, it takes me back into the editor, and I can now change it and I can see versions. So that's quite fun to do. To get access to things like the logical modeler, you click on the icon at the top there. You see they come up through here. Notice that some of these actually open in a separate window, indicated those by this little icon here. When you go to the logical modeler, so you can see it's calling up a separate window. This is, of course, it's going to the conformance server. There it is there. Here are the models that already exist. So I can go and I can look at any of these models like so. I can create a new model by clicking on this new model button, or I can edit things. So for example, I've got this thing called test 1. I can add a new element to that. I indicate the name of the element, which is a thing. I indicate what it is, it's a thing. And then there's your data type there. And if I select codable concept, for example, I now have the option here of selecting the value set from the server. This is again why I was saying before. So I can go into here, I can select, say, cond. So remember the value set's on the terminology server there, so it's going away doing a query against the terminology server. There's problem diagnosis codes, so select that guy there. So that's now gone away, it's picked up that value set. What's kind of fun is you can do expansions on the value set, so if I want to make sure I've got the right one, I type in ASTH, and I get a list back. So that's it, you can find a value set, expand on it. So when you're sure you've got it right, you click on select, and that now adds it to the model element that you've got, and I save that back through there. And so that's now added an element called thing of that type there. If I click on that, I can go in and I can actually view the value set through there. And of course it builds things like the mind map on the fly, the table, and other views like that. So this is the logical model. This is really new. Like this is about 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old. So it's pretty raw. But I think this is going to be where a lot of the action occurs, particularly if you're if you're dealing with end users. Got you 5 minutes. That's that guy there. I won't go any more than that. What you can do, which is kind of fun, sorry, I just have to point this out, is you can go to there. I'll add a new element. Another thing. I'll make this one a string, and I'll save that. You can reorder to some extent, so that other thing, if I click that up arrow button like so, it inverts them so you can move it around to get your model looking nice. So that's the logical modeler. It's just, I'll just can that, go up to dead, go back to ClinFire. Let's go and look at the value set editor. No, let's look at the extension definitions. That was the screen through there. Number of different ways you can do it. So this one's looking at the publisher. So these are the publishers for Orion. Or if I wanted to, I could look at all of the extension definitions that can be applied to, I think I've got some of the basic, like so. So this is searching through, okay, there are none there, to create a new extension definition. I click on that link there, type in the name of the extension, dev days, click the check button to make sure it doesn't already exist. The save button comes up so I know I'm good to go. Indicate what resources can use this extension. I'll say condition and basic perhaps. So again, you indicate what are the ones that can be used at. There's where you add your actual elements to the extension definition. I indicate the data type. If I indicate that it's codable concept, I can do the same sort of thing. I can bind the value set and I can select it in exactly the same way as I did before. It's the same screen. If I decide I don't want that, I can get rid of it and change it to a string, so forth, click on add. So I've now created a simple extension definition called dev days, which is a string and which I can use against the basic resource. Save that, and God willing, there we go, extension has been saved and it's now back in the list here. Should it come up? I'm not going to consider myself too much. I'm going for time, running up to time, 2 minutes. That was either 2 minutes or it was peace.
2 minutes.
I'll go for the peace. Okay, so that's extension definition. Profile works the same sort of way. Go into your profile here, create a new profile, give it a name, dev prof, like so, check it, indicate the profile that your extension for your thing like condition, sorry, the profile that you, the base resource type that you are profiling, the publisher, and save. Okay, that comes back to here, so I now have the, now brought me to the screen, I can edit this profile, which means I can now go in and I can say, for example, the clinical status is not part of my profile, I'm not interested in stage, like so. I can go to here, I can add a child extension, find extensions that can be used against these dev days when I create it right there, combine that and so on and so forth, so I can go through and create my profile. Click on the save when I am done. There it is, that's now been saved. So I now have a profile called dev prof. So I can go into dev prof right there and I can create a new resource instance. Like so, and as you can see, dev days have now been added to the bottom as being an extension. So that's, I've got 20 seconds left. So that's like just a quick run through. As I say, I'm around if you want to talk further. If you're interested, those are the exercises. Thank you for listening. Go forth and profile.